Making headlines for this week of March 6th, Netanyahu's nerve. Israeli leader's massive ego trip and political grandstanding may also be digging his political grave. Abused becomes abuser. A Jewish perspective on what the Israeli leadership has become. When bankers call, lessons that the tragic events in Ukraine have reminded us of once again. And empowering mothers, a female executive's apology to corporate mothers, what she learned and what she did with those lessons.
With news around, upon, within, and beyond our planet, the program making disclosure official. This is Cosmic Vision News. Here is Jeffrey West.
Greetings and blessings to all. Once again, I find myself in a position of not really wanting to give attention to a story, but at the same time, it is important for people to hear some of the other perspectives being reported about this particular event. Shakespeare's Macbeth described life as but a walking shadow, a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Arguably, this may appropriately describe Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's appearance before the U.S. Congress on March the 3rd, courtesy of the U.S. Republican Party and Republican Speaker of the House, John Boehner. The address has polarized politicians within the U.S., but may also put him on thin ice back home. After almost 2 decades of proclaiming the dangers of Iran, and after almost 2 decades of nothing, perhaps Netanyahu's hour upon the stage of political life, at least, may be finally starting to wane. If nothing else, the next few weeks leading up to the Israeli national election should be extremely interesting. In a brief exchange with Gordon Duff of Veterans Today, he confirmed to me that Netanyahu has many enemies, both within Israel and also within the U.S. In Israel, with 2 weeks before an election, you know things might be starting to go badly when a national publication, Haaretz, runs a comedic spoof on Netanyahu's speech and allows a U.S. comedian to describe the excessive standing ovations given to him as the longest blowjob a Jewish man has ever received. Here are a few highlights.
Shalom. My friends, welcome to a very special night. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, addressed Congress today in observance of the sacred Jewish holiday of Sukkot. Mr. President, it was a festival of slights. It's a blessed tradition dating back all the way to January when House Speaker John Boehner invited Netanyahu to speak to Congress without consulting the White House.
I did not consult with the White House. The Congress can make this decision on its own.
Is this just a way to sort of poke the president in the eye?
I don't believe I'm poking anyone in the eye.
Of course, Benjamin Netanyahu was on hand to explain to our Congress why our president should not be negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. And even though Netanyahu was speaking only 2 weeks before the Israeli elections, he wasn't there just to use our Congress as the most elaborate campaign commercial backdrop ever.
I feel I am representing all the citizens of Israel, even those who do not agree with me, a representative of the entire Jewish people. I feel a deep and sincere concern for the safety of all citizens of Israel and the fate of the state and the fate of our people.
I speak for all Jews, including the ones who don't want me to, because those Jews are wrong. They'll thank me. After all that buildup, I was pretty excited for the speech itself, but nowhere near as excited as Congress, which cheered so loudly as Netanyahu entered the room, they broke C-SPAN's sound equipment. It was a miracle. A standing ovation that was to last for just 1 minute miraculously lasted 8. Oh my God, it was the State of the Union address the Republicans wanted. delivered by the leader they wish they had. And Netanyahu wasted no time explaining why there was no time to waste.
That's why this deal is so bad. It doesn't block Iran's path to the bomb. It paves Iran's path to the bomb. Iran's breakout time would be very short. About a year by U.S. assessment, even shorter by Israel's.
Bibi, if Iran's that close, why didn't you bring your urgent warning about Iran going nuclear sooner? Oh, wait, you did. Apparently time was also running out 19 years ago.
The most dangerous of these regimes is Iran. If this regime or its despotic neighbor Iraq were to acquire nuclear weapons, this could presage catastrophic consequences. Only the United States can lead this vital international effort to stop the nuclearization of terrorist states. Time is running out. We have to act.
What many in our government love about Netanyahu is his conviction and his certainty.
In the Middle East, Iran now dominates 4 Arab capitals: Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a.
We have to act. Look how Iran has expanded its power since the fall of Saddam Hussein and the destabilization of the region.
If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region. The reverberations of what happens with the collapse of Saddam's regime could very well create an implosion in a neighbor regime like Iran.
Or the opposite. But in the House chamber, there was no such reflecting. Netanyahu wrapped his speech up, and it was time for another 10 minutes of applause. Whether or not Netanyahu achieved his goals of sabotaging a deal with Iran or mistakenly opened up a rift in U.S.-Israeli relations, one thing is certain. The in-chamber response to this speech was by far the longest blowjob a Jewish man has ever received.
Ben Norton, contributing to the Mondo Weiss website, actually noted all the interruptions. In his article on March the 4th, Norton writes the following: "To say it was just well received would be to commit the callous crime of understatement. In Netanyahu's pep rally, speech, before the U.S. legislative branch, Congress interrupted to applaud 39 times. 23 of these were standing ovations. 10 minutes 55 seconds of the total 40-minute 30 seconds of Netanyahu's exhortation consisted of applause. In other words, 27% was Congress applauding and doing standing ovations." Norton broke down the times of all the applause and standing ovations for any who wish to see this. The link, like all, will be in the show summary. The resistance is beginning to show in the U.S. The New York Times ran a full-page advertisement saying that Netanyahu does not speak for American Jews. Over in Israel, Gil Hoffman and Tovat Lazaroff wrote in the Jerusalem Post on March the 3rd that opposition leader Isaac Herzog condemned Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to Congress on Tuesday in an address he chose to deliver in Nir Moshe, a community near the Gaza Strip. "There is no doubt the Prime Minister knows how to speak well, but the truth is that the speech, as impressive as it was, did not prevent a nuclear Iran and won't impact a deal that is being drafted. Not on its content, nor on its timetable," Herzog said. "The painful truth is that after all the applause, Netanyahu is alone, and Israel is isolated, and the negotiations will continue without Israel's input. The speech sabotaged Israel's relations with the U.S. It will not change the view of the administration, only deepen the rift with our strategic ally." Chris McGreal, writing for the London Guardian, wrote that in the end, Netanyahu sidestepped the nuclear option and did what he does so well: scared American politicians to death. The White House had warned the Israeli Prime Minister of trying to wreck Western negotiations with Iran by revealing inside details of the deal being hammered out over Tehran's atomic program. Netanyahu's aides had darkly hinted that he would do it anyway. The White House reaction summed up the speech: all rhetoric, no new ideas, no action. The Obama administration's swift put-down was a clear signal as any that the already poisonous relationship between the Israeli Prime Minister and the President of the Jewish state's most important ally is not going to get any easier. Netanyahu tried to paint the furor over his address to Congress 2 weeks before the Israeli general election and arranged behind the White House's back as a baffling misunderstanding. I deeply regret that some perceive my being here as political. That was never my intention, he said. His speech said otherwise. It was evidently aimed at the electors back home and the president's opponents in Congress. Media station KCBD covered a press release of Netanyahu's speech by Texas Republican Randy Neugebauer, who stated that today Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu delivered a historic and powerful speech clearly outlining the threat the world faces from a nuclear Iran and radical Islam. I was honored to attend this speech, and the United States must stand with Israel, our closest ally and friend in the Middle East. The Obama administration's absence at today's speech sent the wrong message to the world. I will continue to work with my colleagues in Congress to make sure that Iran's dream of a nuclear weapon never becomes a reality. The Politics USA website noted the response from potential independent presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. In its article, they wrote that besides boosting his election chances back home, Netanyahu was trying to provoke military action against Iran. The Democrats who skipped the speech did not miss anything. Netanyahu's remarks could have been delivered by Dick Cheney, George W. Bush, or any number of a variety of Republican neocons. There was nothing in his speech that the American people didn't hear thousands of times during the Bush administration. Netanyahu tried to argue for war, and Bernie Sanders called him out on it. Chris Matthews, writing for the addictinginfo.org website, wrote the following. Blow by blow, Netanyahu pilloried Obama's negotiations with Iran. He hectored the president like a school principal scolding an errant child. There was zero respect shown to the office of the U.S. president or the diplomatic relationship between the nations. But it wasn't just President Obama that Netanyahu threw shade upon today. The Israeli PM also echoed a distasteful trope common in modern, muscular Israeli society, that victims of the Nazi Holocaust were too weak. The libel won huge applause by Congress and mass support on Twitter. Adam Epstein retweeted Netanyahu's hypocritical comment that the days when the Jewish people remain passive in the face of genocidal enemies, those days are over. However, Jewish American journalist Max Blumenthal was quick to point out the implications of this slight on victims of the Nazi Holocaust. He tweeted that Netanyahu's speech insults the memory of Jews who resisted fascism in their native lands. True to the Zionist narrative, he called them weaklings. Americans and members of the international community worldwide looked on in shock at the servile reaction of Congress to a speech so overtly hostile to stated American policy and historical victims of anti-Semitism. There are a few glaring errors with the narrative that Netanyahu is trying to sell to the U.S. and the world. Jim Fetzer of Veterans Today described the speech as a masterpiece artfully woven of lies, deceit, and deception. He pointed out the 10 points that he felt were misrepresented. 1. Iran has not attacked another country since 1775, something that was reported on CVN sometime last year. Washington was inaugurated in 1789. 2. The sanctions imposed are war crimes. They violate the Geneva Conventions of 1949. 3. Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapons program. Our intel agencies and Mossad agree. 4. Iran is entitled to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes, so the U.S. is violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has signed the treaty. Israel has not. The U.S. is also violating it with new weapons. 5. Israel is the terrorist state. It commits atrocities in Argentina, which it blames on Iran. 6. Israel was complicit in 9/11, brought to us by the CIA, the DoD, neocons, and Mossad. 7. The Holocaust is a prop. 6 million Jews did not die in gas chambers using Zyklon B. 8. He is playing politics with Congress. He claims when Bibi speaks, the world listens. 9. The leaders of Israel despise non-Jews. Consider the words of former Prime Minister Menachem Begin. The article cited a quote by Begin, who allegedly described the Jewish people as a master race. And 10. We, the U.S., are doing the dirty work for Israel. The time has come to end it. The article includes another speech given by retired four-star General Wesley Clark. CVN has previously played a statement made by Clark in 2001 indicating that the U.S. was planning to invade a number of countries in a very short period of time. The following is an excerpt of a speech given by Clark in 2007. He describes a meeting with former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz in 1991. He closes with a very relevant point of reflection for all U.S. citizens, Republican or Democrat.
Time, and he brought me in, and I said to Paul, I said, and this is 1991, I said, Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm. And he said, well, yeah, he said, but not really. He said, because the truth is we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we didn't. And this was just after the Shia uprising in March of 91, which we had provoked, and then we kept our troops on the sidelines and didn't intervene. And he said, but one thing we did learn, he said, we learned that we can use our military in the region, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop us. He said, and we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes. Syria, Iran, Iraq, before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us. And it was like I'm coming out of the Mojave Desert. I've been training troops. I haven't been thinking geostrategy for some time. And suddenly a guy just sort of shoves this nugget at you. Well, you remember it. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict? We're going to invade countries? And, my mind was spinning. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld. You could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control. It went back to those comments in 1991. Now, did anybody ever tell you that? Was there a national dialogue on this? Did senators and congressmen stand up and denounce this plan? Was there a full-fledged American debate on it? Absolutely not. And there still isn't. And that's why we're failing in Iraq, because Iran and Syria know about the plan. All you have to do is read the Weekly Standard and listen to Bill Kristol, and he blabbermouths it all over the world. Richard Pearl the same way. They could hardly wait to finish Iraq so they could move into Syria. This wasn't what the American people voted George Bush into office. Well, they didn't actually vote him into office, but it wasn't what many of the people who... It wasn't what he campaigned on. He campaigned on a humble foreign policy, the most arrogant foreign policy in American history. He campaigned on no peacekeeping, no nation building, and here he is with Afghanistan and Iraq. It's astonishing. So the root of the problem is not how many troops are in Iraq. Please believe me. Don't be mad if you're a Democrat at your Democratic congressman because they can't reduce the troops and frustrate the president. That's not the issue. And if you're a Republican, don't be mad at the Democrats because they're fussing with the troops. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, if you're an American, you ought to be concerned about the strategy of the United States in this region. What is our aim? What is our purpose? Why are we there? Why are Americans dying in this region? That is the issue.
Even Iran is calling out Netanyahu on his alleged facts. Other than the historical fact that Iran has not attacked another country since 1775, an RT article on March 5th reported that Iran has no intention of destroying Israel and has actually saved the Jews' lives 3 times across history. But the current Israeli regime is a threat to Tehran, according to Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif. And he said this in an interview with American media. Speaking with NBC, Zarif slammed the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu after he once again said in his Monday's speech before the Congress that Iran openly threatened to wipe Israel off the map. The Iranian foreign minister urged Netanyahu to refresh his knowledge of history, as his comments have not only distorted realities of today, but also go against the Bible and Jewish sacred texts. He even distorts his own scripture. If you read the book of Esther, you will see that it was the Iranian king who saved the Jews. It is truly, truly regrettable that bigotry gets to the point of making allegations against an entire nation which has saved Jews 3 times in its history. Once during that time of a prime minister who was trying to kill the Jews, and the king saved the Jews. Again during the time of Cyrus the Great, where he saved the Jews from Babylon. And during the Second World War, where Iran saved the Jews. We're not about annihilation of Jews, Zarif stressed, reminding the channel that 20,000 Jews reside in Iran in peace, and even have their own representative in parliament. We never had the bomb. We will never have a bomb. We're not looking to have a bomb. We do not believe a bomb is in our interest, whereas Netanyahu does have a bomb. He has 200 nuclear weapons, he said. In what may be a sign of the changing times, 3 of the major U.S. networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, chose not to televise Netanyahu's speech, but NBC did give time to Iran's foreign minister for comment. If there was any doubt whether or not Netanyahu's speech was politically motivated, the answer may be in an article in the Huffington Post on March 5th by Bill Moyers and Michael Winship. Their article writes that everything you need to know about Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's address to Congress on Tuesday was the presence in the visitors' gallery of one man, Sheldon Adelson. The gambling tycoon is the godfather of the Republican right. The party's presidential hopefuls line up to kiss his assets, scraping and bowing for his blessing, which, when granted, is bestowed with his signed checks. But Adelson was not only sitting in the House gallery on Tuesday because of the strings he pulls here in the U.S. He is also the daddy warbucks of Israel, and Netanyahu is yet another of his beneficiaries, not to mention an ideological soulmate. Although campaign finance reform laws are much more strict in Israel than in the United States, Adelson's wealth has bought him what the historian and journalist Gershom Grubenberg calls uniquely pernicious influence. Adelson owns the daily Israel Hayom, a leading newspaper, as well as Makor Roshon, the daily newspaper of Israel's Zionist religious right, and Energy, a news website. He gives Israel Hayom away for free in order to promote his hardline views. The headline in the paper the day after Obama's re-election was, "The U.S. voted for socialism." In fact, as Israel's March 17th election approaches, Adelson has increased the press run of Israel Hayom's weekend edition by 70%. The paper says it's to increase circulation and advertising, but rival newspaper Haaretz reports political sources are convinced the extra copies are less a part of a business plan and more of one to help Netanyahu's re-election bid. The Haaretz article continues. Just like the timing of Netanyahu's State of the Union address to Congress this week was merely a coincidence, right? And then they quote or re-quote Netanyahu's statement, "I deeply regret that some perceive my being here as political." Netanyahu told Congress, "That was never my intention." Is there a factual basis for the claims that Netanyahu is making against Iran? According to Robert Kelly, in an interview on the Real News Network on March 4th, there is no basis for such claims. According to the TRNN website, Kelly is a licensed nuclear engineer who has worked on many aspects of nuclear weapons and later on nuclear non-proliferation. His personal experiences include weapons simulation testing, plutonium metallurgy, isotope separation, and emergency response. These experiences were extremely useful in carrying out intelligence analyses of foreign countries and lead to field experience as a chief inspector in Iraq nuclear weapons inspections and elsewhere. He is currently affiliated with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in Sweden and several other non-proliferation organizations. Kelly was quoted in the article as saying, "Right now, you've got lots of inspectors crawling all over Iran. Just in round numbers, they're performing 1,000 man-days of inspections per year. That's a lot. And so people know exactly what's going on in the country. The International Atomic Energy Agency is the eyes and ears of the world, and they're doing a difficult job and doing it well. If he screws this thing up and he forces the status quo to be destroyed, which is what it seems like he's doing, and then use those inspectors, then there will be a war. Right now, the inspectors are preventing it." The question is going to be whether or not the American people in particular are going to buy into this little charade that is being played out at their expense, literally and figuratively. Simon Black, in an article on the Sovereign Man website on March 3rd, noted that only hours ago, on March 3rd, Gallup released a new poll showing that only a small minority, just 17% of Americans, still view the U.S. as the world's economic superpower. Echoing former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers' quip, "There is surely something odd about the world's greatest power being the world's greatest debtor. It appears that economic reality is finally beginning to set in for Americans." Jim Willey will be commenting a little bit more on this in the financial news. Gordon Duff, writing for Veterans Today, noted on March 4th that this visit would be the end of Netanyahu. He writes, "An epic failure on a Homeric scale, a humiliation he can never recover from." He goes on to add that hundreds of rising stars at the Pentagon, deeply flawed incompetence rapidly promoted after Bush and Cheney's mass firings, both before and after 9/11, have been removed, most court-martialed for fraud and sexual abuses. Legal experts agree Netanyahu's visit to the U.S. as a foreign diplomat without State Department approval was illegal. Moreover, Republican Boehner's invitation as a private citizen, as he has no international standing and has no right to represent the U.S. with foreign powers, misused public funds and violated U.S. law. This is nothing compared to the real backlash inside America's Jewish community and the majority Democratic Party. Netanyahu will never be officially invited to the United States again. He can't. He has burned down that bridge. Anyone meeting with him or any American leader traveling to Israel while Netanyahu is still in office will not be unscathed by yesterday's fiasco. So it remains to be seen as to how the next 3 weeks are going to play out and how the U.S. people, the U.S. politicians, the people of Israel, and the other Israeli politicians act and react leading up to this potentially monumental shift in geopolitics should Netanyahu be removed from power, and should Adelson's wealth be denied another chance to influence not only Israeli politics, but also U.S. foreign policy. If we explore the energetic dynamic of what is playing out right now, particularly with Netanyahu, we see the high school bully who was either abused himself or is compensating for a fear or insecurity that exists within him. Philip Mondeweiss, in an article on his blog site, noted the following: "It is my belief that much of the Jewish establishment's view of the world is a trauma-induced delusion, because we don't need to be hidden. Others do, including many Palestinians from Jews. The actual Jewish condition in Israel is they are occupiers. The abused has become the abuser, as the recovery movement explains. Be still, the fear is there. And the fear blinds Jews to our power in Israel and the United States. It is hard for Jews to think of ourselves as powerful because of a historical and collective memory of persecution. Yet the world regards us as powerful. It sees the Jewish state as a nuclear-armed country with a huge army, and it sees Jews as an elite in the United States with a ton of clout. Why is the American Jewish community so determined to convince itself that we are living in 1938? The late Tony Jute asked 9 years ago, why does the most successful, the most well-integrated, the most culturally and politically influential, the most socially and economically well-situated Jewish community since the late years of the Roman Republic, why is it so worried about the demon of anti-Semitism? He goes on to talk about the historical power that the Israeli lobby group has had in the U.S. over the years, but he also notes how this power is waning. He cites several reasons, but he also adds the following. The lobby's power is waning because the post-traumatic period is coming to an end and Jews are no longer monolithic on Israel. Ideas of Jewish nationalism and separation are as discredited by the Israeli experiment as communism was by the Soviet one. Young Jews are bridling. David Remnick is bridling. Benjamin Wittes is bridling. David Rothkopf is bridling. We're going to see a jailbreak from the idea of the necessity of a Jewish state inside the establishment, and Netanyahu has fostered that. God bless him. Who are we, and what is our role in the world in 2015? And this is Weiss still writing here. We were a ghettoized elite in Western societies, subject to the worst forms of persecution in Europe. Now, out of trauma, we are licensing some of the most glaring forms of persecution in the world. Norman Finkelstein's mother, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, told him that the lesson of the Holocaust was that this should happen to no people. Her experience was a human experience, and its lessons must be extended to all humans. And today, there is only one test of Jewish social and political values. Where do you stand on Palestinian human rights? The Palestinians are the people whom our collective helped to dispossess, slaughter, and put behind checkpoints out of an inevitable, but in the end, self-involved concern with our own history. We victimized them because of our own victimization, and the test of our future is when we come to recognize this responsibility and how we act on it. Many Jews will rise to that challenge. Just wait and see. James Redfield, author of the Celestine Prophecy, the 10th Insight, and the 11th Insight, described 4 primary control dramas that humans engage in when things do not go their way. They may become the intimidator, or the bully. They may become the interrogator, or fault finder. They may become aloof, or the vague avoider of questions, or they may become the poor me, the victim. What we see in Netanyahu is the intimidator control drama. He is a soul very much stuck in the 3D drama of feeling his power by dominating others and forcing them to surrender to his wishes and demands. In terms of the overall progression through the original 9 insights offered by Redfield, Netanyahu appears to be stuck on the 4th insight. According to Redfield, the 4th insight is this. Too often, humans cut themselves off from the greater source of this energy and then feel weak and insecure. To gain energy, we tend to manipulate or force others to give us attention and their energy. When we successfully dominate others in this way, we feel more powerful, but they are left weakened and often fight back. Competition for scarce human energy is the cause of all conflict between people. As I have tried to share previously in defining the term life capitalized and offering a possible definition for peace in the world, We begin to move beyond the need for conflict when we see, feel, and know our connection to this larger energetic process I call life capitalized. This is also the fifth insight Redfield offers, the insight that many global leaders will either soon choose or be forced to accept. The fifth insight, according to Redfield, insecurity and violence ends when we experience an inner connection with divine energy within, a connection described by mystics of all traditions. A sense of lightness and buoyancy, along with the constant sensation of love, are measures of this connection. If these measures are present, the connection is real. If not, it is only pretended. Everything is energy, and all energies act and interact with all other energies. If one is choosing to hold negative energies toward a global leader, or if one is holding a desire for revenge against a member of the global cabal, you are mirroring the energies that the cabal has been putting out in the world, and this is the response they want to get from you. Just like the Emperor in Star Wars who taunted Luke Skywalker into getting angry so that he would lose control. This loss of control is what the cabal feeds on and requires from humanity. It is when Luke Skywalker pauses and observes himself and how he is becoming like his father, Darth Vader, that Skywalker turns off his lightsaber and declares that he will not be turned to the dark side of the Force. This is where humanity is being called to be compassion in the face of the darkness that is coming up for release and healing at this time. Forgiveness does not mean letting them off the hook for what they've done. It is merely the giving up of the attachment to the energies of what has been done as an excuse to justify how one is living in the world. Events are starting to come to a head at this time, it appears, and therefore it is vitally more important that those who are more aware and grounded at this time use their energies to anchor energies, frequencies, and vibrations of love, peace, harmony, compassion, forgiveness, and service to humanity, our planet, and our galactic families. I invite you to join me in sending energies of love and compassion to various leaders worldwide who are still openly attached to energies of the Zionist agenda. Help them remember who they are, or send them the loving energies that will drive them to flee from their positions of power and control. Last week, I promised listeners that I would start going into the deeper history of Israel and how it links to events that are unfolding across the Middle East. I have discovered that this story is much bigger than even I had thought, and it will take some time to find a way to piece it all together in a way that will make sense. However, there is one journalist who seems to have done a pretty good job of putting together one piece of the puzzle. This is the piece of the puzzle I choose to share with you this week. Ben Swan offers his report from February 27th on the origins of this group known as ISIS.
The name ISIS is one that every American knows by now. The biggest threat to our national security since Al-Qaeda, right? They are a brutal, savage group known for public beheadings and mass executions. They are the face of the new war on terror. Right now, the U.S. military is conducting airstrikes in Syria in a supposed attempt to take out ISIS targets. Meanwhile, the White House and military leaders are talking about possible boots on the ground in Iraq again, only 3 years after the war in Iraq was declared over. In fact, this war, according to former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, could last for decades.
We're looking at kind of a 30-year war kind of history here.
Allahu Akbar! So who exactly is ISIS, and where did they come from?
It's entirely a creation of the United States' behavior in Iraq. That's how we got to where we are, because of war, because of occupation, because of torture.
For answers, we traveled to Los Angeles to meet with Angela Keaton, the founder of antiwar.com.
We destabilized and wrecked Iraq. I mean, it caused it to fail miserably, and that's entirely the responsibility of the United States government. There's no one else at fault there. I mean, as horrible as Saddam Hussein was, there was, Iraq was not unstable. It was a functioning country as much as those sorts of things go, and it was not a particularly horrible hellhole if you were a religious minority.
To understand where ISIS comes from, you have to understand two storylines. The first is what Keaton just said. When the U.S. first went into Iraq, we blew the country apart. We destroyed the government, toppled Saddam Hussein, destroyed infrastructure, and most importantly, left behind a power vacuum. One that would have never have existed had Hussein not been overthrown by the U.S. government. Daniel McAdams with the Ron Paul Institute says this is an historical fact that media just won't discuss.
All of this has to do with U.S. action in the region, which destroyed the infrastructure, which destroyed Iraqi society, which destroyed the government. You had a lot of people who lived under Saddam Hussein, who may not have been as happy as larks. Nevertheless, they were living somewhat normal lives. The U.S. put a government in power in Baghdad that all of a sudden was their enemies, that treated them very, very badly.
Now that is the easy part of the story. The U.S. created conditions in Iraq where ISIS could get its start.
I'm going to ask you to remember that last statement because in a few moments we're going to be hearing a story about the Ukraine, and I want you to keep in mind what was just said so that it can be compared to what is currently happening within Ukraine.
But here's the other storyline that you have to understand, that even with Saddam gone, ISIS still couldn't have risen to power had it not been for what happened next. ISIS actually began as a small insurgent group in Iraq in 2006. They had no money, no real ability to recruit, but they did work to create very limited problems for the U.S. military. It wasn't until 2009 that ISIS shifted its focus from Iraq, where it was largely unsuccessful in developing a foothold, and focused on the civil war in Syria. Even there, ISIS struggled to gain any foothold, because the two largest groups fighting against President Bashar al-Assad were al-Nusra Front, or al-Qaeda, and the Free Syrian Army. Then came a pivotal moment that most Americans aren't even aware of. In June of 2013, a northern general for the Free Syrian Army spoke out on Al Jazeera, Qatar, and stated that if international forces did not send weapons, the rebels attempting to overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad would lose their war in just 1 month. Well, only months before, I had personally confronted President Obama about why the U.S. was covertly funding those Syrian rebels.
And yet there's some concern about the U.S. funding the Syrian opposition when there are a lot of reports that al-Qaeda is kind of heading up that opposition. How do you justify the two?
Well, I share that concern, and so what we've done is to say we will provide non-lethal assistance to Syrian opposition leadership that are committed to a political transition, committed to an observance of human rights. We're not going to just dive in and get involved with a civil war that, in fact, involves some elements of people who are genuinely trying to get a better life, but also involve some folks who would, over the long term, do the United States harm.
So even as the president acted as if he was being careful, politicians like Senator John McCain demanded action.
So it's a totally unfair and unbalanced fight. And now the rebels are the freedom fighters, the Syrian National Army are being beaten every place around Syria because of the overwhelming firepower, and air power is really the deciding factor. So you've got to take their air power out of it. You've got to have a safe zone where they can operate, train, and equip. And we've got to turn this thing around.
So what happened? Well, within just a matter of weeks of that Syrian general making his plea for international help, the U.S., the Saudis, Jordan, Qatar, Turkey, and Israel began providing weapons and training and money to the so-called rebel Free Syrian Army. By September of 2013, American media outlets, including CNN and the Washington Post, were reporting that CIA-funded weapons had begun flowing to Syrian rebels. The weapons were not American-made, but funded and organized by the CIA. The artillery was described as light weapons, some anti-tank weapons, and ammunition. But where it all fell apart, weapons that the U.S. insisted would be used by freedom fighters would be in less than 1 year in the hands of ISIS fighters. So where were these fighters coming from? Actually, from the Free Syrian Army, the group that John McCain insisted would help the U.S. to overthrow Assad. That same group actually giving weapons, selling weapons, and sending fighters to join with this new group called the Islamic State. It was in June of 2014 when suddenly, after being a no-name group in Syria, that ISIS emerged, heavily armed and trained by U.S. and coalition special forces, making a dramatic entrance by crossing back over the Syrian border into Iraq, capturing Mosul and much of the northern part of the country. One of the most important facts that mainstream media ignores time and time again is that ISIS was able to grow so fast because of all the U.S. military equipment they were able to seize, equipment that our military left in Iraq, truckloads of Humvees, tanks, and weaponry that instead of taking or destroying, the U.S. government simply decided to leave behind. Even when the U.S. government knew that ISIS fighters were capturing that equipment, for crying out loud, these guys were posting pictures of themselves driving and standing on U.S. military equipment, making video of themselves with it, we did nothing. Why?
How is it the U.S. had no idea that this threat was coming? How many billions do we spend? Maybe $100 billion on the total intelligence community budget over the year. How is it that they had no idea? How is it that if this was such a threat, as John McCain and Lindsey Graham are fond of reminding us, how is it that it was missed so unbelievably, so egregiously?
Over the past few months, the U.S. government, who acted like they had never even heard of ISIS, suddenly, with the help of media, has turned the Islamic State into the new focus of the war on terror. Now, as ISIS has continued its rise, recruitment is exploding, and the group is becoming stunningly wealthy.
ISIS is the best funded terrorist group in the world. They make I think it's $2 million a day selling oil, much of it to Turkey, interestingly enough. And if you look at the U.S. response to this, the U.S. response to ISIS becoming extremely rich by selling oil and undercutting the competition is to blow up the oil fields, which to me makes no sense. You're blowing up the infrastructure. It happens to be in Syria, so you might think that there is another motive there. But why wouldn't the U.S. sanctions anything that moves when it's angry? Why can't you sanction the banks that are helping finance these deals? Why can't you sanction the oil companies that are participating in this? Why do you blow up the oil fields?
It's a great question. And here are some other questions that defy logic when you start looking for answers. Why is the U.S. sending $500 million to the Free Syrian Army to fight ISIS when the FSA is one of the biggest suppliers of fighters and weapons to ISIS? Why are we sending new and more powerful weapons to the FSA, like anti-aircraft missiles, weapons that we know will end up in the hands of ISIS?
ISIS, of course, is going to now have anti-aircraft missiles provided by the U.S. and the Saudis. The Saudis are getting them from the Chinese, though, now, so there can be plausible deniability because inevitably these sweethearts in the sweetheart rebel groups in Syria are going to start shooting down, if they have the ability, passenger jets. And then we're going to want the plausible deniability. Say, no, it's the Chinese weaponry, as if it's going to make any difference.
Well, there are so many questions that we could ask, but let's just cut to the chase here, because what you need to know about this is that ISIS is not the creation of American inaction, which is what the media is going to tell you. No, they are the product of direct action. First, the action of creating a power vacuum in Iraq, and secondly, arming violent jihadists, hoping they would overthrow a leader in a neighboring Middle Eastern country. McAdams says the U.S. government is a victim of its own insane policies.
Well, I think the U.S. is really a hostage to its own regime change philosophy. The U.S. is very good at blowing things up and destroying societies, but it is very, very bad at putting them back together.
Is that true? Well, you decide. Fact. Our government armed Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and created Al-Qaeda. Fact. Our government helped supply Saddam Hussein chemical weapons for him to use against Iran in 1980 and then overthrew him in 2003. Fact. Our government trained rebel fighters in Syria who have become the group today known as ISIS or the Islamic State. We have watched them commit every violent atrocity that you can imagine to people living in Iraq and Syria. And now we want American taxpayers to fund a 30-year war against them. No, it's not the U.S. government being held hostage by these crazy policies. It's the American people. And it's time that we reject the destruction of people groups around the world for the sake of foreign policy that makes so-called defense contractors rich and perpetuates violence, death, and destruction of entire people groups. Because humanity is greater than politics.
Although Israel is not mentioned directly in this report, there are current and historical links to Israel and this geographical region, and some of this will be explored, hopefully, in the upcoming broadcasts. In financial news this week, it would be really interesting to be a fly on the wall of some of the financial meetings that must be going on worldwide at this time, as some people try to make sense of what is going on, while others desperately try to hide what is going on so that the people of the world do not find out what is going on in the world. Well, it may be too late for that last one. In a recent interview posted by financeandliberty.com, Elijah Johnson questions guest Jim Willey of goldenjackass.com. Willey offers some insights on Greece and on events playing out in Europe and Ukraine and how it ties into the changing geoeconomic structure. The following are selected excerpts from that interview.
To begin with, Greece is going to leave the European Union. I've been saying this for 2 to 3 years. This is not new. It's going to be new only to the naive, to the corrupt, and to those who are not paying attention. No, people who say, oh no, they can never leave the Union. You can't do that. Well, give me 3 reasons why that don't involve pressure of bribery or murder. And those are very big pressures, bribery and murder. When you got a lot of narco money, you can bribe a lot of bankers, you can bribe a lot of parliamentary members, you can bribe even the Prime Minister's office. When Alan Greenspan came out 2 weeks ago and made his confirmation that eventually Greece will be leaving the Union, the corrupt knight has confirmed the obvious, which means now it's something that the banker cabal can no longer deny. We're in for a gigantic Lehman event, I think 5 times larger than the Lehman event of 2008. So if one big bank goes, another big bank will soon follow, and we could have 8 to 10 in the following 2 or 3 weeks. A gigantic Lehman event is coming.
That's very interesting. And getting back on the topic of the European Union, you've said that not only Greece is going to leave the European Union, but also Germany is going to leave the European Union. Did you want to discuss a little bit about this?
I heard last spring, it was May and June, that Germany made a decision to leave the European Union, to leave the European Monetary Union, which means the euro currency, and that means NATO as well. They made the decision last May and June, and I heard this from 2 independent sources with connections with Russia and China. Independent connections. They confirmed it within a few days of each other. Yes, our Russian clients, yes, our Chinese clients are confirming that Germany will leave the common euro, that Germany has plans to leave the European Union. They're already fashioning their agreements with Eurasian Trade Zone. They're lining up their contracts for trade settlement outside the dollar. All these things take time. This is very big. Germany's already left the EU in spirit. A big event took place 2 weeks ago. Very, very big event. Merkel from Germany and Hollande from France, their 2 leaders, had a meeting with Putin. Putin had a lot of information to share with German and French leaders. In attendance was the Ukraine puppet, Poroshenko, who doesn't have much long to remain in the palace in Kiev. He's already shipped his family out. They're gone. They're not in Ukraine anymore. And what I'm told is that Putin shared a lot of information, that it was very likely information about shooting down the Malaysian airliner. So Putin showed some data that was in evidence of the Ukraine military shooting down the airliner. Putin also, so I'm told, gave evidence to the French and German leaders about the nature and characteristics and background of some key Western prime ministers and presidents, the leadership, and gave some other information about the planning of the Ukraine war and its agenda. We've got a situation where Russian data is getting out and having an influence on France and Germany. Angela Merkel continued with a shuttle to Washington and a shuttle to Canada, and it was done with haste. And what I heard that came out of the meetings with U.S. leaders was a sequence of face slapping. Biden tried to argue the case for the Ukraine war. Are you kidding me? This is game over, Mr. Biden. Merkel essentially told the U.S. Vice President, you get on board with this truce, or the U.S. is going to be isolated and labeled a rogue nation. This war serves no purpose. There's a lot going on in Ukraine. I don't want to get into the details, but the urgency of the meeting with Putin, meeting with Merkel and Hollande, was the surrounding in Debaltseve of lots and lots. We're talking about over 1,000 soldiers being surrounded and bombarded, to the point that they started calling it the Debaltseve cauldron. They're just getting devastated in that surrounded area. And included inside was mercenary troops. Mercenaries from France, Poland, United States, including Blackwater. So Putin was trying to save the troops and avoid a slaughter, and that's what got the Americans' attention. There's a lot of talk inside Germany lately now on two other scores. One is the Gazprom pipeline. Merkel is now making public statements that they're in favor of completing the Gazprom pipeline through whatever route the Kremlin decides. So if they want to avert Ukraine and go through Turkey, whatever. But it's needed to come through the southern routes into Austria and Germany. The other thing that the German conversation lines are about now is open discussion to save the Russian trade. It's very significant. There are between 3,000 and 5,000 German companies doing business with Russia. It's not going to stop. The sanctions, whatever have been imposed, whatever are enforced, are temporary and they're going to go away. And afterwards comes hard feelings, resentment, and retaliation against the United States. We're in the end game here, Elijah. This is game over. The war is over in Ukraine. The U.S. will be the last to admit it because the U.S. will be instigating various moves to interfere with the Minsk truce agreement. It's game over with Germany. They're going to flip. They've already started. They're making advanced steps now toward moving east. Very few people understand the connections between Germany and China. It is enormous capital investment in China of German equipment. Look for Caterpillar to be pushed out of Asia because they're American. You're going to see vast damage to the American, U.S.-based multinational corporations because the Asians, led by the two superpowers of Russia and China, are going to be pushing and pressuring various countries to honor German contracts, European contracts and suppliers, and to cut out the North Americans. You're going to see the same effect in Latin America. The U.S. is going to be isolated in an astonishing way in the coming several years. We're going to get a return to the gold standard from all these dead ends. They're going to be fixed. The dead ends will find solutions. They're going to stick, but they'll only stick with the dollar no longer the standard for trade settlement. The problem areas all have U.S. fingerprints on them. And when the trade is done with gold settlement, the next step you will see is major nations of the world ordering that their banks divest of treasury bonds. And that's when the problems come full circle. All the problems the U.S. is doling out the rest of the world, they come back to the U.S. in a vast boomerang. The U.S. dollar will have to be replaced. A lot of people say, oh, the dollar's king, and dollar's rising. No, it's rising in exchange rate, not value. The toxic dollar exchange rate rose while the oil price went down, or vice versa. Doesn't matter. They were tied at the hip. And they revived the petrodollar through the Forex derivatives, Elijah, and put a guarantee on the Treasury bond in 2012 called QE, Bond Purchase Program. Well, now it's breaking And the Saudis are no longer our buddies. I don't care if they're photo ops with King Abdullah, who since died, and John Kerry, the Secretary of State of the U.S. You aren't told what they argued about under the tent. They're arguing about ISIS, because the Saudis and the Americans are the agent funding, training, supplying ISIS. It's a guarantee of permanent war. So much is going on. ISIS is getting exposed. The Syrians downed a British plane that was supplying ISIS. Didn't make the news in the West, but sure did all over Europe. So, a lot of systems are breaking, Elijah. We covered the hot spots. We covered the symptoms. So, we're going to see some major defaults from emerging market nations and restructures, just like Greece. There are 20 other Greeces out there, is my point.
In a follow-up to that, an article posted on March 6th by Joseph Adinolfi and Brian Aguilar of MarketWatch reported that currency wars have begun. Their article notes the changes that various global central banks have begun implementing since the beginning of the year to compensate for changes taking place in the geoeconomic structure. It started out with the country of Uzbekistan making a change on the 1st of January. Romania followed on the 2nd, Switzerland, Egypt, and India on the 15th of January, Peru on the 16th, Denmark on the 19th, Canada and Turkey on the 21st, the European Central Bank and Denmark again on the 22nd, Pakistan on the 24th, Singapore and Albania on the 28th, Denmark once again on the 29th, Russia on the 30th, Australia on February 3rd, and Denmark made its fourth change on February 5th. Sweden on the 13th of February, Indonesia on the 17th, Botswana and Japan followed on the 18th, Israel on the 23rd of February, and then Poland on March the 4th. So we may not fully understand yet what is going on, but as has been said before, it is becoming more than abundantly clear that something is indeed happening within the global banking system. As Willie alluded to moments ago, this may be part of the preparation for the movement to a global gold standard within currency markets. It may also be countries beginning to adjust in anticipation of an alleged global currency reset, which may be part of this new system that appears to be starting to come online at this time. In another interview with Willie, Willie talks about the central banks buying 100% of the sovereign debt. Now, I admit I have not yet listened to this interview, but I will be posting the link in the show summary for those who are interested in financial news and who may benefit from hearing that interview also. The lessons that many are finally starting to see are the consequences of what can happen to a country when international bankers are allowed to come in and take control. An article by Reuters correspondent Juan Medina and posted on the Wealth Watchman blog site noted some of these consequences. The article from March 2nd offers that Novorossiya, with her many victories, has still paid dearly for her resistance. Ukraine's citizens, though, while being duped by their bankster government, have suffered enormously at the hands of these fiends for failing to resist. Both have suffered, but for completely different reasons. In just one short year, the Ukrainian nation has been utterly hollowed out by the IMF and Washington, D.C. The banker horsemen unleashed upon their populace continue to up the ante of their destruction with each passing week. Medina goes on to tell of the gold heist from the Ukraine Central Bank and the secrecy by which this looting took place, something that was reported on CVN last year. In speaking of the former president, Medina writes, "Say what you want about the former ousted President Yanukovych, but the absolutely undeniable trend he'd set of steadily building up Ukraine's gold reserve was instantly reversed, and the sovereign wealth of Ukraine was plundered by the bankers now pulling the strings." The gold looting was not the end of it. Medina continues in writing that, unsurprisingly, since losing their gold and spending every last cent of IMF blood money on war, their currency, the hryvnia, is in utter freefall. For a while, the central planners in Kiev tried to peg their currency to the US dollar at roughly a rate of 16-1. Earlier this month, though, when they announced they could no longer defend this peg, they began to let their currency float. It was only then that the true extent of the damage which the bankers had done to their currency began to be understood. The article offers charts that show the wild fluctuations of the currency during February. Medina observes the minimum wage in Ukraine as being lower than third world countries like Zambia or Ghana. This has now led to the next form of IMF-induced terror, and that is empty food shelves. The result has been a campaign of endless war that the cabal-installed regime in Ukraine has been forced to fight. Medina writes that the populace, through numerous propaganda barrages, has been fooled into thinking that they've been fighting Russian forces. The truth is that their commanders have forced Ukrainian soldiers to regularly point their heavy artillery and tank fire directly towards civilian targets in the general populace. For months, many hundreds of times, bridges, suburban areas, schools, hospitals, bus stops, and basically any other target with no possible military value has been purposefully targeted by the bankster Ukrainian forces. The tragic part about it all was that just as the Ukrainian people thought they were going to be rid of some rather oligarchic leadership in that key moment, they were instead handed someone worse by orders of magnitude. It was a cynical and cruel trick to use such a revolution in order to slave this populace, but no one ever accused our enemies of being a beneficent bunch of folks, have they? The Ukrainian people have not only unwittingly let in their worst possible foes, but made them heads of state as well. In just one short year, after letting in this parasitic class, they've lost their gold reserves, they've lost food reserves and experienced shortages across the country. They've lost many thousands of their sons and daughters on the battlefield. They've lost their economic stability. They've lost the coveted cheap natural gas contracts they once had with Russia. They've lost entire regions of the country forever due to peoples succeeding to take their lives back. They've lost their freedom of expression as authorities now go on witch hunts for those who even express support for breakaway regions. They've lost the hope that their country can have governance that actually wants to make their country a better place. He concludes with a warning that the U.S. could become just like Ukraine when the U.S. dollar collapses, but he does offer a prayer that the Ukrainian people will stand up to the banker regime and institute actual sovereignty and self-determination, even though it will be painful. Iceland did it, and they survived. Medina closes, "Let the fate of poor Ukraine be a lesson to us all. When the Western bankers come a-knocking and bearing gifts, you must bar the door at all costs. Suffer not a single one of those monsters to enter your country, lest they unleash these dark and powerful forces in your midst as well." In tech news now, coming out of Australia recently, a new technology has been activated, claiming to provide grid-connected energy from devices placed under the water. The technology also claims to supply desalinated water as well. According to an article by Miles Goff appearing on the ScienceAlert.com website on February 23rd, reports that after more than a decade of testing and demonstrations, Australian company Carnegie Wave Energy has switched on a pilot project that has begun feeding wave-generated electricity into a local Western Australian grid. This report comes from Courtney Bembridge of Australia's ABC News.
In Western Australia, the switch to the world's only operating wave power station has been flicked on at the Stirling Naval Base to provide electricity to the facility south of Perth. The Perth company, which created the wave farm, hopes it'll be the first of many along the coast of Australia.
Almost a decade of research, trials and construction went into today's power-up.
The minister's about to push the button.
The wave farm, now anchored to the seabed off Garden Island, will provide enough energy to power 2,000 households. As the waves pass over these large buoys, pressure is created and transferred back to land. That water under pressure turns the turbines, generating electricity for the naval base. It will also be used to run a small desalination plant to supply fresh water.
Our wave resource in Western Australia is the best in the world, and theoretically the resource that hits our coastline every day could power the state 10 times over.
The federal government spent $13 million on the project and has committed another $13 million for its expansion.
Look, it's a win all round, but we need to do it at a pace where mistakes aren't made and where we achieve each milestone in an orderly way.
Wave energy differs from other renewable energy sources like solar and wind because it provides a relatively constant supply day and night.
The challenge from here on is really about scale and cost. We need to make the technology bigger, we need to make our projects bigger because that's what allows you to get your costs down.
The company is now working on plans for another much larger wave power project expected to be operating in 2017. Courtney Bembridge, ABC News.
Goff's article adds that this is the first array of wave power generators to be connected to an electricity grid in Australia and worldwide, said Ivor Frischknecht, CEO of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, in a statement. The company's technology, named CETO, C-E-T-O, after a Greek goddess of the sea, converts ocean swell into zero-emission renewable power and zero-emission desalinated fresh water. The company says its system is different from other wave energy devices as it operates under the water, where it is safer from large storms and also from corrosion and is invisible from the shore. The units currently in operation are classified as CETO 5, generating about 240 kilowatts of energy. A larger scale unit is being developed with claims that it can provide 1,000 kilowatts of energy. Turning to health news now, we look at a story that historically has pushed buttons within many women, given the economic corporate paradigm that has been consuming humanity for the entire lifetime for most of us. It is a story of health, the health of the divine feminine, the health of women, of mothers, of their children, and of the health of humanity in the future. We're in a challenging period. Men and women are seeking to find themselves more and to find meaning and some sense of purpose in their lives. Women especially have found it challenging as they have been forced to play the corporate game in the form of the male bonding structure in order to move up the ladder. This vertical climb may be appealing to many women for a period of time, but when that other time comes, either by choice or by circumstance, having a child suddenly changes the dynamic. This change is often not to the benefit of the soon-to-be mother. As the global cabal and their systems of corporatized control are being exposed and gradually shut down, many women, who are also mothers, are trying to find ways to be productive in the world while also allowing them to serve their families in the highest way possible also. After all, these children will learn from these mothers how to act, serve, behave, and how to model a better future for humanity. It is a period of transition and transformation. Not all women will be called to a solution such as the one this story is now introducing. However, for those to whom this story does resonate, it may offer a potential answer that they have been looking for. An article posted on the Fortune.com website on March 3rd tells the story of Catherine Zaleski, a former corporate executive who played the game, and often she herself never even gave much of a thought to the women who chose to become mothers. This is the story of her wake-up call, her shift in being, and what she chose to do about it.
That's how the co-founder of the women's job placement startup Power to Fly describes the plight of the working mother. Her Fortune.com mea culpa to them went viral and brought massive attention to the topic. Joining me now is the author of the story, Catherine Zaleski. Catherine, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for doing this piece for us.
Well, thank you.
For the two people who haven't read it yet, just tell us the premise. This is an apology to working mothers. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, the premise is that, there's sort of a systemic problem, I think, in our society where younger women don't recognize a lot of the value that working mothers do at jobs because they're sort of valuing on the hours spent in offices and not their output. And I'm not saying all working mothers, I'm saying me in particular felt that before I was a mother.
You sort of judged these women who had other commitments, and then you became a mother, and this all changed.
Yeah.
Why do you think it took having a child of your own to realize that maybe was not the best way to go about thinking about these women?
I think, obviously empathy is a great teacher. You only have so many points in your life where you teach yourself lessons. Definitely getting some criticism from people who say, well, why weren't you empathetic before you had a baby? Or do you need to have a baby in order to understand these things? No, you don't. But in my own personal journey, like definitely having a child and understanding just the simple time commitments that, it takes to raise a child, very much contradict with the way we've set up offices and office culture. Right?
So how does the culture not change? I mean, what ways has it not changed and needs to?
We need to sort of end the idea that your work is valued on physically being there.
So that's your company. Your company does that. You offer remote job placement for women. So, but the rationale of that, though, doesn't seem to necessarily be improving the situation for everyone. You're basically saying, instead of making the workplace better, let's just remove the women from the workplace.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I never said remove the women from the workplace.
I'm not saying you said that. I'm just summarizing your business idea. It's definitely easier for working mothers to work at home.
What we're saying is basically 1 billion women are coming into the workforce in the next 10 years. 80% of them, as I say in the piece, are going to be mothers. We see more women dropping out of the workforce now than since the 70s when they started coming into the workforce. So there's a problem. There's a clear problem right now. And so this is just one solution to the problem. But this is by no means taking women out of the workforce. It's allowing them to continue to have careers while they also have lives.
As the report stated, this story went viral and created quite a response. 2 days later, a commentary appeared on the Fortune.com website on the 5th of March by Jane Stevenson, the Vice Chairperson, Board and CEO Services at Korn Ferry. She shared her experiences as a corporate executive and mother. One evening while traveling, she missed her sacred call home to her children before bed due to a corporate meeting. She wrote the following: "When I called home much later that evening, my husband said, if you can't excuse yourself from a client dinner for 5 minutes to say goodnight to your children, then you are working with the wrong people." Needless to say, I never missed that evening call again. Over the years, I have learned how to juggle being a mother and a leader. Being a working mom has helped me to set my priorities more clearly. More importantly, it made me realize the value in working with the right kind of people. In my experience, most people relate more easily to our choices when we own them, not when we play the victim. Although the story is focused more on women, there is a message that men can also take away from this story. Although working moms should never have to apologize, the only reason they are forced to in the first place is because of the way the corporate paradigm has been set up that enslaves humanity to systems of debt, fear, and separation. Neither women nor men should feel like victims, enslaved to a system for fear of survival. Unfortunately, there are many who are willing to trade away their lives for the glamour of the corporate world. I was there at one time. For just over 3 years in North America, I was in a different city almost every week, and I loved it, while getting pretty low pay and only 2 weeks vacation. I decided to temporarily accept the same job in Sweden when I became fed up with being having that kind of treatment in North America, and I used this new job in Sweden as an entry point to finding other employment to get away from the corporate atmosphere. It was different in Sweden, however. My salary almost doubled, and in my first year I had 6 weeks of vacation and not 2. This resulted in me choosing to stay with the company for an additional 4 years, for I felt to be crazy to give up this kind of a benefit. It is true that when one is appreciated more, one is willing to give more. North American companies, however, do not seem to recognize nor honor this. People are too busy in North America to spend much time sitting at parks, but in Sweden during the summer, people leave work and the parks are full of families sitting and eating together. Kids are playing and everyone is enjoying the sunlight and being in nature. If you aren't feeling completely happy with what you are doing, then you are working for the wrong people. It is time to start listening to your heart. Now is not the time for wallowing in energies of victimization or complaining. There are solutions out there for you to create, or solutions to partner with, or solutions to participate in, if you are open-minded and open-hearted enough to listen to your inner voice at this time. I have realized that a time is coming when I need to ask for some assistance in preparation of this newscast. I am spending far too much time sitting at this computer, and I'm starting to notice the impact that it is having on my health. Longtime listeners to CVN will be somewhat familiar with the style of the newscast I deliver. If there are people out there who have some experience as journalists, or who are passionate writers and researchers who might be wanting to try writing and recording a story for CVN, I would like to invite people to contact me. I would like to start first by trying to find people who are interested in health and technology or science stories. If this appeals to you, you can perhaps put together a story, write it, and then send me the story with all the sources you used to reference that story, along with the recording, so I can get a feel for your voice and your spoken style. I admit I am going to be very demanding with the recording, and this may be hard for some people, so I am saying this now. CVN has an international audience, and many listeners do not have English as their first language. Therefore, reporters must be sensitive to this and try to use simple words and language that are easier than some of the more complicated words and phrases in the English language. As well, when speaking, I am looking for people who know how to communicate, when to pause to highlight an idea, and who speak fairly slowly, clearly, and who enunciate words well, so people who do not speak English can easily understand better. It sounds demanding, and maybe it is. I have observed other media sources, however, that do not seem to respect that there are people who do not speak English or understand it well. The media expects everyone to adapt to English, where I personally feel I want to try to adapt, at least a little bit, to people who do not understand English as well. If I am unable to speak your language, at least I can help you to understand me in the best way I am able to. If you did not speak a language, how would you want someone to communicate with you? I would really like to start spending more time away from the computer for this summer, if at all possible. So if there are people who demonstrate a talent or interest or passion for communicating global change in a style and manner that is consistent with the vision of CVN, I would like to start giving some others a chance to share that skill, and maybe someday empower them to start their own newscast. I would especially like to encourage the women journalists to give this a try. I would like to have a woman's voice on several reports on the newscast to balance out my own voice. At this time, I regret I am not able to pay a regular salary, although perhaps when CVN finally does receive its big break, perhaps then I will be able to compensate contributors to the newscast. You can contact me through email, info@cosmicvisionnews.com. And in this week's final words, no doubt Many who are truly and honorably serving humanity and our planet have taken stock of their lives, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, and wondered why their lives have not gotten better, or why honest and sincere people are having such a hard time getting by. It is not an easy question to explore, and the answer may be equally as hard to hear for many people. It could be related to one's soul contract, or it could be related to choices that one has made in one's life path, which may or may not be related to one's soul contract. Everything that happens in one's life can invariably be brought down to one of these 2 criteria. The same could be said about every single type of conflict in the world. It matters not the conflict, from an unkind word to a slap across the face, to the dropping of a weapon of mass destruction. It comes down to one root cause: fear. Let's face it, for our entire lives, we have been accustomed to drama, excitement, action, money, sex or sexual appeal, and perhaps a few other similar distractions. The cabal-controlled media and entertainment industry has done its job well getting people addicted to programs, events, and attractions that are linked to these energies. They stimulate people because they provide the neuropeptide combination that goes out to the cells of the body to give the body its chemical fix to fill its addiction. Anything else, and the people will simply turn off. Don Henley, lead singer for the group The Eagles, had a hit in the 1980s that summed up the media and its formula for success, and that song was called Dirty Laundry. Most of the souls that are currently serving humanity and the planet in the more honorable ways are struggling. And again, let's face it, what I am doing, what many or even most of you are doing, is neither sexy, appealing, dramatic, exotic, stimulating, or perhaps more importantly, profitable to the point of being self-sustaining. Sadly, we do not, yet, appeal to the ranks of people who still need the neuropeptide chemical fix for their addictions within the physical world at this time. They have not yet gone through their withdrawal process that most of us have gone through. Therefore, we are left supporting each other. We preach to and we support the choir because we understand each other. We get each other. The challenge for these honorable and hardworking souls is to see others who are claiming to be working honorably for humanity and the planet, making an overly abundant excess of material wealth, while not applying that wealth to the being of the message that they are communicating. Numerous spiritual gurus, quote-unquote, as some have called them, fall into this category, unfortunately. I am not saying that this is the case with everyone. There are some very wealthy philanthropists out there who do share, and they do it quietly, without fanfare, because they have released their attachment to the ego's need for recognition and glorification. There are numerous sources on the internet right now who have carved out for themselves a very successful niche market. Some are known disinformation agents. Some are deliberately cashing in on the movement without any sincere desire to promote global change or awakening. Some may have had an original intention to do something honorable, but have been pulled off their paths by succumbing to addictions relating to wealth, status, popularity, and in some cases, power. Their presentations, their programs, and their blog sites have become successful because they have found a niche that is linked to the old paradigm addictions, and they are capitalizing off of this. It could be understood if some souls chose to follow this path, because in this time of transition there are still bills that have to be paid. The argument, however, is that if one is still choosing to pay illegitimate bills, then they are still living within the collapsing paradigm, and therefore still living within the illusion, and thus still living under the fear and control of the global cabal, and ultimately living in fear within the illusion of separation of the oneness of life. CVN used to have a phenomenal following back when the newscast was offering the kind of information that was feeding the craving that people were looking for to get their fix. Some of the highest rated CVN shows were the ones that fed into the addictions that people were seeking. Since that time, having pulled back from that degree of sensationalism, the ratings have dropped dramatically. CVN does not have the success of other programs on the internet because it does not stimulate the mind in a way to promote the chemicals that provide the fix that addicted souls need. Therefore, it cannot affect change on a broader level that it could affect. This, however, does not stop me, nor should it stop you in your service to humanity and our planet. Parents who have lost a child will ask their divine creator what they have done to deserve such punishment. One can accept it as punishment and use that as an excuse to think, feel, and act a certain negative way in the world. They can also choose to use their pain in a positive way and turn it around into an experience of learning and also higher service. Those of us who are having such a difficult time surviving may be asking the divine source creator a similar question. What have I done to warrant this kind of hardship? It is not that one deserves hardship, and I use this term loosely because if we look at the poorest in Africa and what they are living with, even the poorest among us still have a life of luxury. I have to keep reminding myself of this and allow myself to be humbled every time I think about complaining. It is relative, however, and no human's pain and suffering is greater nor less than that of any other human. The point is, no human anywhere should have to go through this experience. Unfortunately, we have a group of people whom I call this global cabal, who are seeking to perpetuate this experience for their pleasure, power, profit, and control. And there are people who choose not to awaken and are quite content to be led along like sheep to the slaughter. This punishment that one thinks one believes one is feeling is not necessarily a consequence directed only at that individual, but a sum total of all the choices made not only by that individual, but by the global cabal and by all the souls who choose to not awaken. Another example, people pay taxes under the excuse that it is the law. Well, first, it is not a law. It is a rule that has been given the force of law. Secondly, it is a rule that each soul has chosen to consent to, unless they have chosen not to consent to it. This consent has been freely given, even if people do not realize or understand that they have given it freely. Emma Thompson and her husband Greg Wise have a point. They can't arrest everyone, and they have indicated their willingness to go to jail until those who have cheated and stolen from people pay their fair share of tax, or until the general population awakens enough to start holding politicians accountable for their actions. Not everyone has the luxury to take a risk like that. Not everyone has the level of courage to take a risk like that. We, those of us serving humanity and our planet in the most honorable ways we are able to, are leading by example. We are willing to pay the price to be the example that will be an example for others who are sitting on the fence to follow. The group of humans that are more consciously aware of what is going on in the world are a bit like the old, unpopular clique in high school that is suddenly starting to become popular just by demonstrating a behavior and attitude that resonates with more and more of the people around them. I especially honor and acknowledge those among us who are prepared to risk being arrested and potentially harmed by rule enforcement officers trying to uphold commercial law. We all have a role to serve, but those who are helping to expose by putting themselves into positions of possible harm deserve our added love, support, and energies of protection for their service. I salute, honor, and thank each of you in your continued strength, courage, and service to humanity, our planet, and our galactic families. Create a wonderful week until our next moment of now. So that is the unfolding consciousness news around the world this week. Cosmic Vision News is a part of the Enlight Universal group of programs. Links to stories used in this broadcast are published in the show summary on the blog at cosmicvisionnews.com, on the CVN Facebook and Scene pages, and also on Google+, YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you for sharing your time with me. I'm Jeffrey West, reminding you to not surrender to the fear of the changing times. Anchor love and compassion to help those who are ready to awaken to do so as comfortably, as easily, and as safely as possible in their service for the highest good of all. Until our next moment of now, stay grounded in love, hold the vision of light and peace in your hearts, and keep your eyes to the skies. Disclosure is unfolding all around you. Namaste.